I am now going to explain to you how the neural impulse works. So to begin, we will first start with the structure of a neuron. First of all, every neuron has a cell body, which is also called a soma. And inside every cell body is a nucleus right here. Now, these branch-like structures attached to the cell body, those are called dendrites. Then there is a thin wire-like structure also attached to the cell body, and that's called the axon. At the end of the axon is this structure right here, which is more root-like. This is called the axon terminal. And then, not noted on this diagram, but right here at the end of each one of these root-like structures, that's referred to as the axon terminal buttons. And then finally, there is a substance that coats the axon. It surrounds the axon, and that's called the myelin sheath. So when a neuron is triggered, something called the neural impulse occurs. And the neural impulse is an electrochemical response, and I'll explain what that means. So when something triggers a neuron to fire, what happens is electricity occurs and it moves through the dendrites, through the cell body, and then electricity travels down the axon all the way until it reaches the axon terminal. And at this point, that stimulates the release of chemicals into the synapse, the space between neurons, and these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. Now, before we move on, I just want to mention the purpose of the myelin sheath. The purpose of the myelin sheath is to coat the axon and prevent any leakage of the electrical current. So the purpose of the myelin sheath is fast conduction or fast electrical impulse. All right, now let's go to the next slide to talk about it a little bit more. All right, now here's a slightly different diagram of a neuron. So once again, we have the cell body, we have the nucleus, we have the dendrites. Now here's the axon terminal, and then here's the myelin sheath. Now right here, this represents the axon terminal button, as I mentioned before. Now right here, this is a magnification of the axon terminal button. So right here is the axon terminal button, and then there is a space between one neuron and another neuron. That's called the synapse. And then this right here represents the dendrites of the postsynaptic cell. All right, so again, this is magnified. So what is going on here inside the axon terminal buttons? There are vesicles that contain those chemicals I mentioned called neurotransmitters. And once the neural impulse, once that electricity travels down the axon and reaches the axon terminal buttons, that stimulates the release of these neurotransmitters into the synapse. So these chemicals are released into the synapse. Then on the dendrites, so here's the dendrites up here, right? But of the postsynaptic cell, there are structures called receptor sites. And the neurotransmitters will then bind onto the corresponding receptor site, okay? So, and I'll talk about the specific neurotransmitters shortly, but that will then cause either an excitatory response, meaning that the next neuron will fire, or an inhibitory response, meaning that it won't fire. And then if there are any neurotransmitters left and kind of floating around here that don't bind onto the corresponding receptor sites, what happens is a process called reuptake. And those neurotransmitters are simply reabsorbed back in to the vesicles of the axon terminal buttons. So here's just one more diagram. It's just showing that what we just saw on the last slide, okay, just presenting it to you in a slightly different way. So again, this is magnified. Here's the axon terminal button, And here are these vesicles or sacs, if you like, that contain all those chemicals, the neurotransmitters. Once the electricity reaches the axon terminal button, the neural impulse reaches this, then those neurotransmitters are released here into the synapse, the space between those neurons, and then they will bind onto the corresponding receptor site. Now, there are many different neurotransmitters, and we'll be talking about those shortly, but just a couple of them, just to familiarize yourself. A couple of the main ones that we talk about a lot in psychology are serotonin and dopamine. And the way it works is each neurotransmitter has a specific receptor site that will only work with the corresponding neurotransmitter. So, for example, dopamine can only bind with the dopamine receptor site. It can't bind with a serotonin receptor site, okay? And vice versa. So the easiest analogy is that it's kind of like a lock to a key. So just like a key can only fit one lock, same thing with the neurotransmitters. Each neurotransmitter can only bind with its corresponding receptor site. A couple other principles to know. The neural impulse will always only travel in one direction, and that's from cell body to axon terminal. It will never go from axon terminal to cell body. And one final thing to think about, one other concept to know, it's called the all or none response, or the all or nothing response. And what that means is that a neuron will always either completely fire or not fire at all. The neural impulse will never just half fire and travel maybe halfway down the axon. It's either all the way or nothing. So an easy analogy for that is that it's kind of like shooting a gun. You either shoot the gun or you don't. You can't half shoot the gun. So that is called the all or nothing response. So I'm going to end it here. And then in a little bit, I'll talk more about the neurotransmitters.